Commanders coach Ron Rivera set sort of a deadline for making the decision on whether or not to exercise Chase Young's fifth-year option, but I'm going to give you the deadline during the NFL draft where you can predict whether or not Chase Young will have his fifth-year option picked up by the Washington Commanders. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Commanders.
Your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Commanders fans of the Locked On Commanders podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This is your daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders. Please subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, so you always get the latest episodes when they become available. I'm David Harrison, credentialed member of the media covering your Washington Commanders for Commander Country, a part of Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation. You can find me there, here, or on Twitter at dharrison82, or text me anytime at 202-760-2644. Thanks for making Locked On Commanders your first listen review today and every day. And a special shout out to our everydayers and our subtexters. Appreciate all of you coming through as we bring you Commanders news, analysis, rumors, and speculation 5 days a week. Today's episode is brought to you by HelloFresh. Skip trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit. Get HelloFresh. Go to HelloFresh.com/NFL60 and use code NFL60 for 60% off plus free shipping. Head coach Ron Rivera and general manager Martin Mayhew met with the media on Thursday. I was on hand in Ashburn to talk about the upcoming NFL draft, what was said, what it means coming up on today's episode. And first, we're going to start off with the question that doesn't necessarily pertain to the NFL draft, but the result of the question certainly pertains to the NFL draft, and that is the future of defensive end Chase Young. Of course, his fifth-year option is up for being exercised or declined by the Washington Commanders. They do have until May 2nd on the NFL calendar to make that decision, meaning they can go into the NFL draft weekend without announcing that decision. You would probably assume they kind of have an idea of what they want to do before they get to draft weekend, but they don't have to necessarily announce that decision before draft weekend. So, of course, Ron Rivera was asked about the process of making that decision and when he might have that decision made, to which he replied, "We will wait until May 2nd. Very clean, very sharp, very to the point. Asked as a follow-up if that meant he was going to make the decision on May 2nd or if he would have the decision made prior to May 2nd, Ron Rivera replied, "Well, that is what we have. We have until May 2nd. All right, one more try. He was asked, if today were May 2nd, what would he say? Ron Rivera said, "We would give you an answer." Those are all quotes. Those are all the things that he said. Yes, it was funny. Yes, it was a good time. The question has to be asked. It has to be answered. Ron Rivera knew it was coming. And on the surface, it sounds like a lot of nothing. But really, it actually does mean something, because it means that the Washington Commanders don't want to tip their hand as it pertains to whether or not they'll be looking to draft an edge defender early. And if the Commanders do pick an edge defender early, it still doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't picking up Young's option, or at least that they aren't open to extending him if he were to play very, very well a la Daron Payne, even if they don't pick up his option. Now, I brought up the idea on this show in the past. I'm going to bring it up again today that Washington could decline Young's option, choose not to extend Montez Sweat, and instead basically pay the guy that does the best in the upcoming season. Because if Chase Young beats out Montez Sweat, then it most likely means that he stayed healthy for at least the majority of the season, which is what you want to see. And he also produced. If he doesn't and Montez Sweat outproduces him like he has to, stably for the last 3 years, then you extend Montez Sweat, you let Chase Young walk out the door. Both of those options don't necessarily take defensive end off the board for the Washington Commanders. But if they don't draft, say, a defensive end and edge defender with the potential to step into a starting role in 2024, then it kind of tells you the Washington Commanders are probably opting to pick up Chase Young's option or extend Montez Sweat at a minimum, that one of these two guys is going to be locked in before the new season comes. And quite honestly, that option is most likely going to be Chase Young. Now, of course, if we get news of a Montez Sweat extension between now and the NFL draft, that, of course, changes everything. But as it stands today, if the Washington Commanders draft a potentially startable, and again, this is talking about projection, defensive end in the early parts of the NFL draft, then you can probably predict that one of the two defensive ends will not be back next year. Of course, we said the same thing about Daron Payne. Daron Payne went out there and balled out. Look, if Montez Sweat and Chase Young both ball out, that is an amazing problem for the Washington Commanders to have, even if they draft one of these guys. But Ron Rivera doesn't want to set a firm deadline on when he might make the decision, and that's fair, and that's kind of to be expected. But we can put a deadline of sorts on where the Washington Commanders can find an effective edge defender who has a, say, better than 50 to 60% chance of developing into a future for the 2024 season, thereby giving the Commanders the flexibility, the option, the ability to let one of these two guys walk. Going round by round, there are some options here. Round one, you've obviously got Tyree Wilson out of Texas Tech, Will Anderson Jr. out of Alabama. Neither of those guys are likely to fall out of the top 10, probably not even the top 8, to be quite honest with you. So neither of those guys are really your options. But if you look at the other edge defenders that are expected to be first-round possible players, you've got Nolan Smith out of Georgia, Lucas Van Ness out of Iowa, Miles Murphy out of Clemson, and Will McDonald IV out of Iowa State. Now, Nolan Smith, I'm not 100% sold on. Lucas Van Ness, I'm not 100% sold on as well. Miles Murphy looks like more of an outside linebacker to me. Will McDonald IV is kind of an enigma, borderline round 1, round 2 type of guy. So if you see one of those guys get drafted, especially in the first round, I think you can pretty much bank on either Chase Young or Montez Sweat walking out the door. Now, we've had plenty of discussion every day, as you've been here for all those discussions about whether it should be Montez, whether it should be Chase. And every time we drop an episode like that, I see in the comments, some of you love Montez, some of you love Chase, some of you don't want either of them, and you want the Commanders to ship both of them out of town, which is interesting as well. Going on to round 2, but I think bottom line is round 1, any of those candidates, right? Tyree Wilson, Will Anderson Jr., Nolan Smith, Lucas Van Ness, Miles Murphy, Will McDonald IV, all of those guys, you could say 50 to 60% chance or more, they project to possibly be a starter for the Washington Commanders in 2024 if that situation came to fruition or was needed, right? Now we move on to round 2. BJ Ojulari out of LSU, Keon White out of Georgia Tech, out of Tomiwa out of Bari out of Northwestern, Felix Anudike-Uzomah out of Kansas State, Isaiah Foskey out of Notre Dame are probably your top 5 targets for a second-round pick. Now, some of these guys, again, just like in the first round, they're not all going to translate to 4-3 down lineman defensive ends, right? Some of them are better off as outside linebackers. I would say that added Tomiwa out of Bari out of Northwestern, as much as I love his game, I would probably stand him up if I was a defense coordinator. Felix Anudike-Uzomah out of Kansas State, same thing. I would probably stand him up. But like guys like Isaiah Foskey, Keon White, you can see them playing with their hand in the dirt potentially. So again, if the Commanders come through in round 2 and take one of these guys, then you could start probably look at it and say, okay, we're probably going to see one of those 2 defensive ends leave in the next, in the next offseason. Round 3, we have Derek Hall out of Auburn, Tuli Tuipulotu out of USC, Nick Herbig out of Wisconsin, Byron Young out of Tennessee, Zach Harrison out of Ohio State, and Yaya Diaby out of Louisville. This is, I think, where you have to draw that line, right? Derek Hall, I know some people say he could be a hand in the dirt guy. Some people say he's strictly a stand-up guy. Tuli Tuipulotu, I think he could be a hand in the dirt guy. Nick Herbig is an off-ball linebacker in the NFL. He's listed as an edge, defensive end everywhere, but he is an off-ball linebacker in the NFL, so you can probably take him off this list. Byron Young has got some potential. Zach Harrison certainly has some potential. But I think really you have to draw this line at Tuli Tuipulotu out of USC or Byron Young out of Tennessee. If you get past those 2 edge defenders in the NFL draft and none of them are a Washington Commander, I think Chase Young's option is probably getting picked up. So again, if the Commanders don't make an announcement before the end of day 2 and they don't draft one of those guys, I would say you're probably looking at Young's option getting picked up, whether it's by design or like, darn, we didn't get one of those guys. So now we'll kind of have to give Chase Young that possibility to kind of prove us right, and then at least secure one of those 2. Again, if you end up extending Montez Sweat, fine, you negotiate the contract in a way to where his 2024 cap hit is like $6 million to eat up the space with Chase Young, $17.5 million. And then if you are still looking to replace Chase, you go after hard in the 2024 NFL draft. I'm still saying I don't see it happening. I don't think that the Washington Commanders are going to pick up Chase Young's option, which means I do think one of these names I just listed is probably going to be drafted in the first 100 picks by the Washington Commanders. But some of you are holding out hope that Chase Young's option will get picked up. You think it should get picked up. And I'm certainly not here to kill your hope for that. I've been wrong before. I'm not having intimate conversations with Ron Rivera and Martin Mayhew about that decision. So I'm just giving you my opinion, I guess, how I'm reading the situation. If I'm wrong, I will happily be wrong and hope that Chase Young proves me even further right and comes back not only healthy, but explosive and dangerous to opposing quarterbacks. Of course, it can also mean a draft weekend trade is on the board. So lots of flexibility going on, like Martin Mayhew reiterated multiple times during the pre-draft press conference on Thursday in Ashburn. But Coach Rivera also said something very interesting about the correlation between player success and collegiate schemes. We're going to dive into that comment and what it might mean more on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And we're going to dive into that thanks to our friends over at Built Bar. Something exciting is coming to Built.com on April 22nd. That's this Saturday. I don't have all the details yet, but the excitement is real, and it's something you won't want to miss. If you can see the conversations going on in the Twitter NFL channel DM for the Locked On Podcast Network here, you would be just as excited as we are. If you know how Built works, they have the most incredible protein bars in the world, and they do these amazing flavor drops with unreal flavors in limited quantity. So make sure you mark your calendars for this Saturday, April 22nd, and head to Built.com on April 22nd to be one of the first to discover what all the hype is about. I can't wait to see what the new flavor is. Make sure you use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your order at Built.com. Thanks for making Locked On Commanders your first listen or your first view every single day. Locked On's NFL mock draft special is here, and it's bigger than ever. Follow along all 32 teams' first round picks in a 6-episode ultimate mock draft experience only Locked On can deliver. All episodes are available right now on the Locked On NFL Draft stream on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you're a pro defensive back first round pick guy or gal, you're going to like my pick. Well, you might like my pick for the Washington Commanders. You're going to like the position. I don't know if you'll like the player. Let me know what you think of that pick, of course, in the emails, Twitter, on the YouTube comments, or via text, via subtext. Looking at more comments from Coach Rivera and General Manager Martin Mayhew's pre-draft press conference on Thursday. Ron Rivera was asked if collegiate schemes really mattered when it came to translating into NFL success, to which Ron Rivera replied, quote, "I think it carries the same way. It really does, because again, you really have to be very aware of that. And sometimes it doesn't translate. That's something we learned a lesson a couple of years ago. So again, you have to really be even more diligent now because of what you do. It really has to fit, and the player has to fit. If you don't get that, you'll find out. And that's the tough part, because a little bit of this is projection. You're trying to project whether or not the guy will fit in what you do offensively, defensively, or even special teams. That was one of the conversations we've been having in our meetings, is will some of these guys fit, and when they have to play special teams as well," end quote. Now, Coach Rivera didn't say who he was speaking about as far as learning that lesson a couple of years ago. But a couple of years ago, the Washington Commanders added cornerback William Jackson III in free agency. It's not the same thing, right? But when you look at fits and you look at scheme fits, certainly didn't work out. So if you're talking about learning a lesson about making sure that the person you're evaluating has done things you're going to ask them to do in the future, I think it certainly kind of applies here. Again, I'm not even saying that necessarily that's the lesson they were talking about learning, but to me, it's what kind of popped in my head. And it got me thinking about some of the players that we see mocked to the Washington Commanders most often in mock drafts here this NFL draft build-up season. And according to Mock Draft Database, that collects all kinds of data about mock drafts all over the interweb and kind of compiles all the data, Penn State cornerback Joey Porter Jr. is the most often mock drafted player to the Washington Commanders at pick number 16. 38% of the time, mock drafts are sending Joey Porter Jr. to the Washington Commanders. By far, the most single player drafted to the Commanders in mock drafts. The second most drafted player, Illinois cornerback Devin Witherspoon, 12.5%. And then the third most is Oregon cornerback Christian Gonzalez, 8.9%. So certainly the masses believe that the Washington Commanders need cornerback help, and they most often send Joey Porter Jr. in to be that help. So looking at defensive back usage, right? Look at Ron Rivera's comments that yes, the scheme and what a player was asked to do in college does matter for what you're going to ask them to do in the NFL. You want to make sure that they can do the job, right? Well, only one defensive back played more man coverage than zone coverage for the Washington Commanders last year, and that was rookie cornerback Tariq Castro-Fields, who played one coverage snap of man and none of zone. Every other defensive back on the roster had a greater number of zone coverage snaps than man snaps. For most, it wasn't even a close comparison. Like the zone coverage snaps outweighed the man coverage snaps by a large margin. The closest was Rashad Wildgoose, who played 2 more zone snaps than he did man. Everybody else, it was a wide gap. The top slot defender last year, in fact, was Bobby McCain, who played 341 snaps in zone coverage and 146 in man. So if you're drafting a cornerback to this team, and again, we've had this discussion, right? The biggest factor in this whole thing is what are the Commanders planning on doing with Benjamin St-Juste? If they're going to move him back inside like they were planning on doing last year, then you need a perimeter guy. If you're moving him, if you're keeping him outside like he ended up being after William Jackson was benched and eventually traded, and he did very, very well outside of injuries, then you need a slot guy, right? So that's kind of the up in the air. But bottom line is, no matter whether it's a perimeter defender or an interior defender, as far as cornerback is concerned, right, slot guy, you need that guy to be able to play zone. Like, clearly, the Washington Commanders are going to ask their guys to play zone more often than not. So when you look at these top 3 mock drafted players, again, Joey Porter Jr., Devin Witherspoon, and Christian Gonzalez, you have to look at those identifying factors. Joey Porter Jr., the most often mock drafted cornerback to the Washington Commanders with the number 16 overall pick, played 124 man coverage snaps in 2022. He played 103 zone, so 21 more man coverage snaps than zone snaps, nearly a 50-50 split, right? The problem here is he had a 60.8 grade, according to PFF, in zone coverage. That's not good. It's not horrible, but it's also not good. Illinois cornerback Devin Witherspoon played 322 man coverage snaps, 86 in zone. So a far more man cover guy than zone coverage guy, but he did have a 90.2 grade when he was in zone coverage. So even though he didn't do it a lot, the 86 zone coverage snaps he got, he did very, very well in them. That's something that you take to the tape and is worth kind of exploring. Oregon cornerback Christian Gonzalez played 112 man snaps, 268 zone. So by far the most zone coverage snaps of these 3 guys. And he had an 80.4 grade in zone coverage. So very solid, not amazing, but very, very solid. So out of those 3, I think you could say, okay, according to scheme fit and what their college teams asked them to do, Christian Gonzalez makes the most sense, right? Problem is Christian Gonzalez isn't going to be there. More on that here in a second. Now, when you look at all of those guys, that's total coverage snaps. Now we look in the slot. Joey Porter Jr. played 0 slot snaps. Devin Witherspoon played 61 slot snaps. Okay, so more obviously than 0. 5 for 5 opposing quarterbacks were 5 for 15 against him in the slot, 36 yards, and picked off 1 time. No touchdowns against Devin Witherspoon. Solid zone coverage or solid slot coverage. Oregon cornerback Christian Gonzalez played 93 slot snaps, so more slot snaps than everybody else. Opposing quarterbacks were 11 for 18 against him, 117 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. So again, not as great a stats as Devin Witherspoon, but also 32 more reps in the slot. So Christian Gonzalez, again, by far and away, he plays more zone. He's got a decent grade in zone, and he's played the most slot coverage of all of these 3 candidates. So he's obviously by far and away, from an experience standpoint, the number 1 guy in the scheme comparison to what the Washington Commanders do. But again, the problem is Gonzalez isn't going to be there. Witherspoon is the second best, 61 slot snaps, only 5 for 15 opposing quarterbacks were against him in the slot, 36 yards given up and an interception, no touchdowns. And then you look at it, he played mostly man, but when he was in zone, he had a 90.2 grade, which is solid. But Witherspoon also not expected to be available at number 16. Joey Porter, on the other hand, played more man than zone, and when he was in zone, was not very good. So again, we've kind of had this conversation before on the show. I'm not a huge Joey Porter fits what the Washington Commanders defense is going to do type of guy. I know some of you disagree with me. That's perfectly fine. But I think the numbers and what Ron Rivera is saying kind of speak to maybe that fit isn't there. So who could be a fit? I kind of went to the next 4 defensive backs that might fit what the Washington Commanders are doing. Maryland cornerback Deonte Banks has 213 zone snaps compared to 118 man, and a 72.6 grade in zone coverage. 9 slot snaps, gave up 2 passes on 2 attempts, 21 yards and a touchdown. Tyreek Stevenson, again, more zone than man, 77.5, 19 slot snaps, 6 for 9 opposing quarterbacks were against him, 45 yards and a touchdown. When you come down to it, Julius Brents is another one. I think he was a very good guy, 256 zone snaps compared to 116, only gave up 1 completion in the slot for 1 yard. It was a touchdown. You imagine it's a big body jump up kind of a deal, jump ball is kind of a deal. Michigan cornerback DJ Turner, 224 zone snaps compared to 163 man, 76.3 grade in in zone rather. 34 slot reps, only gave up 64 yards on those 34 reps. 4 of 6 were opposing quarterbacks against them. When you take those 4 guys, I look at this, and from a scheme match perspective and a performance in the slot perspective, I think DJ Turner is your best option. And the good news for that is DJ Turner is not projected to be a first-round guy. Zach Selby and I both think that Benjamin St. Juste is staying outside, which means you need a slot guy. And again, DJ Turner, the most slot experience. And despite the fact that he only had 34, or they had 34 slot snaps versus the second most, which is Tyreek Stevenson out of Miami, who had 19. He only gave up about 20 yards more and had no touchdowns surrendered. So I think DJ Turner is the guy that you look at and say, one for one, he matches the most outside of Christian Gonzalez and Devin Witherspoon. And he's a day 2 prospect. The problem with this projection is that he's getting drafted in mock drafts in the late 50s, early 60s. Well, the Commanders have the 47th overall pick. That's 10 or 12 picks away from late 50s, early 60s. So the question is, do you reach for DJ Turner at 47? Do you care that it's a reach, or that I would call it a reach? Do you do it anyway? Well, General Manager Martin Mayhew said something that kind of applies to the answer of that question, and that's going to come up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders. Looking at scheme fit from college, how it translates to the NFL, Ron Rivera said that it matters when they're looking at prospects, looking at the cornerback prospects that most people are targeting for the Washington Commanders. Again, Joey Porter just does not seem like a huge fit for the Washington Commanders, but Christian Gonzalez and Devin Witherspoon certainly seem like bigger fits, although likely neither of them is going to be there. Out of your next tier cornerbacks, we kind of went through it, and from where I stand, DJ Turner out of Michigan, from the second tier of cornerbacks, is the best fit, followed by, I would probably say, Julius Brents out of Kansas State, then Deonte Banks out of Maryland, then Tyreek Stevenson out of Miami of Florida. Problem here is DJ Turner's range for getting drafted right now is a little bit out of reach for the Washington Commanders unless they reach about 10 or 12 picks to take him. So that brings up the possibility of a trade in order to get into the right ballpark. And Martin Mayhew talked about trading in the NFL draft during the Thursday pre-draft press conference, saying, quote, "There is a position. I don't want to say what it is, but there are some we talked about today. It happens, and what happens is when you have a smaller group of really good players and then 1 or 2 of them start to go, people start to get nervous and they want to make sure they can get theirs, so it's very unpredictable, and I look forward to it. It's a lot of fun. It's a fun process, and we know at the end of it, we're going to be a much better football team." So right there, Martin Mayhew was talking about a run on a certain position group causing it or making it easier for teams to trade back. It happened last year. The Washington Commanders trade back from 11 to 16, fully intending to draft Jahan Dotson. They kind of looked at the board and said, even if a run on wide receivers goes right now, we're good. We should still be able to get our guy. And that's exactly what happened. Chris Olave goes, and I think 2 more receivers went before the Commanders came back up on the clock at 16, and boom, they get their guy. They also trade back. Well, in this scenario, I took 3 popular mock drafts from popular mock drafters: Bucky Brooks, Daniel Jeremiah, Matt Verderame, 2NFL.com, 1SI.com, and around picks 14 to 20, there seems to be about 3 offensive linemen that kind of go inside that 6-pick window, whether it be Broderick Jones, Darnell Wright, or a combination of guys. Meaning, if you're a team at the back end of that window, so like pick 18, 19, 20, and you want an offensive lineman, you may be that team that Martin Mayhew was talking about, getting a little bit nervous watching these offensive linemen come off the board. You might want to be motivated to move up. Specifically, I'm looking at the Buccaneers at 19, the Seahawks at 20, and honestly, even the Steelers at 17. If they want an offensive lineman bad enough, maybe they're not actually in love with Joey Porter Jr. themselves. Maybe they'll do a 1-pick trade up to get ahead of anybody else who might want to trade up with the Washington Commanders. The Buccaneers also have pick number 50 in the second round. The Seahawks have pick number 52 in the second round, and the Steelers have pick number 49 in the second round. So the Seahawks really at number 52 kind of get us closest to that mid to late 50s range that we're targeting for DJ Turner. If you look at the trade charts, you can make a very, very interesting trade here with the Seattle Seahawks where you actually swap firsts and seconds. So the Commanders would actually trade back in the first round and the second round, but would net Seattle's third round pick, which is number 83 overall, and their pick 154 in the 5th round. So that's basically what the trade would be, is Washington would send 16 and 47 to Seattle And in return, they would get 20, 83, and 154, which means you would go from having 3 picks in the top 100 to having 4 picks in the top 100. And at pick 52, which originally belonged to the Seattle Seahawks, you could then take Michigan cornerback DJ Turner. I did a quick mock of this. Not a lot of graphics on today's episode. Trying to get this episode done. Just got back from Ashburn. It's a little bit later in the evening, so I wanted to make sure I got you guys a full episode here, which cut into a little bit of my graphic creating ability. But number 20, I went ahead and took Utah tight end Dalton Kincaid. Again, I've talked about this tight end class and the future of the tight end position. Number 52, we did grab Michigan cornerback DJ Turner. Still a little bit of a reach, but it's a 6-position reach instead of a 12-position reach. And we added pick number 83 to the arsenal in order to do this, where we grab Army edge Andre Carter II. So that's one of those edge rushers in the top 100 picks, right, that you're talking about, that could signal the decline of the Chase Young 5th-year option, which is what I'm predicting happening. So if I'm going to predict that happening, I kind of got to stick to my own projections and give the Commanders an edge in the top 100 picks. And then number 97, we come back, we get NC State offensive lineman Chandler Zavala to end our first 100 picks. Again, in that mock draft, look, it addresses present and future needs with guys who can contribute today. Dalton Kincaid, DJ Turner, Andre Carter, Chandler Zavala, all guys that could be put into the regular rotation with your first 4 picks, especially Kincaid, who projects highly. But tight ends do typically need a year or two to really get their NFL legs under them. So you've got Logan Thomas to still be your starter while Kincaid gets up to speed. Logan Thomas has 2 years left on his contract. Meanwhile, John Bates and Cole Turner are essentially battling it out for tight end number 3, which in 2 years becomes tight end number 2. You've got Dalton Kincaid and either John Bates or Cole Turner at tight end 2, and either John Bates or Cole Turner at tight end 3. But now they've each got 2 or 3 years, or even 4 years in the case of John Bates, of experience under their belt. So that's kind of how that might look. That's one of those runs that maybe Martin Mayhew was talking about. Again, he didn't want to reveal the position group he's kind of hoping there's a run on, which I don't, blame him, obviously. But trying to read between the lines of the press conference on Thursday, and some of this is really, really interesting to me. Is going to impact my final mock draft of the year that's going to drop Thursday morning for you all, and that will be my final predictive. That will be a predictive. This will be what I think Washington is going to do, which is most likely going to be incredibly wrong. But I'm going to appreciate you for listening to it, for watching it if you watch it, just like I appreciate you making Locked On Commanders your first listen or your first view every single day. Every dayers, we've got one more mock draft Monday coming before it's all said and done. So if you want to get your mock draft, get them in, send them in via email at lockedoncommanders@gmail.com, on Twitter at dharrison82, in the YouTube comments, or text me anytime, 202-760-2644 via Subtext. Again, sign off for today. I'm David Harrison, credential member of the media covering Washington Commanders for Commander Country, part of Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation. And most importantly, hanging out with you 5 days a week. Till we speak again, if you're out and about, please be safe, be kind to one another, and I'll see you right back here next time for another episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.